toco aqui para ver.
Então eu confirmo assim que ele começar a falar.
Olá a todos, bem-vindos. Vamos só dar uns 5, 10 minutos, está bem? Porque nós temos algumas pessoas que têm-nos dito que estão presas no trânsito e, portanto, vamos dar aqui uma margem de intervalo, ok? So, in English now. Hello everyone, welcome to Flad. We are just going to give an interval of 5, 10 minutes because some people are caught in traffic and we are waiting for them to come, okay? So, please bear with me and wait a little bit. Thank you.
Então dá aí um toquezinho. Tá, agora tá. Yeah, tá a ver com o ar. Tocar, né? Tá.
És tu, não é?
Ok. Olá, mais uma vez. Bem-vindos à FLAD. É um prazer imenso receber-vos aqui na FLAD, na Fundação Luso-Americana para o Desenvolvimento em Lisboa. I'm now going to switch to English. So, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to receive you here at Luso-American Development Foundation, FLAD, in Lisbon. And we are starting now our new program that we are very happy to present, Meet the Author, where we will bring to Portugal great American writers, fiction and non-fiction, that write about interesting subjects and themes that help us to better understand the United States today. And what better way to start than with Colson Whitehead, winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and with some very interesting books that I recommend very much. I would like to thank you, Isabel Lucas, who curated this series of programs and will be working with us during this season, conducting the conversation with the different writers. And we are now, today, starting a program that what we want to do is that every month we will bring to Portugal a different American writer, and we hope that you can come for the other ones. I just need to see my list. Okay, so then we will have fiction and non-fiction, Anthony Mara, Joshua Yaffa, Anya Yanagara, and Britt Bennett. Those are the ones that are already confirmed, but we are working because this is a program that will continue, and we are working on different authors. So now I have the pleasure to welcome Isabel Lucas and Colson Whitehead for the reading and conversation. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. I guess this is it's okay. Thank you very much for being here to listen. Colson is going to tell us a little bit about his process of writing and creative process, and also about America, as Rita said. But first, we are going to listen to him reading an excerpt of his last book, Harlem Shuffle.
Indeed, yeah. Thanks so much for having me and for coming out. The first time I was here in Lisbon was in the year 2000 for my honeymoon. I'm no longer married to that person, but the good memories live on, and I'm making new good memories. So I read from an iPad because I don't have a lot of upper body strength. So the book is called Harlem Shuffle. It's about a furniture store owner who has a side business dealing in stolen goods. He starts off doing that in a small way, and then as the novel continues, becomes more and more involved in the criminal lifestyle. In this section, he is hiring one of his father's co-workers, if you will. His father was a criminal and used to pull jobs with a criminal named Pepper. And in this section, Ray Carney, our main character, has hired Pepper to do some surveillance on a banker named Duke. Pepper was the first person Carney brought in on the Duke job. Early June, 3 days after the furniture salesman's unsuccessful attempt to retrieve his $500 from the banker. Pepper occasionally used the store as an answering machine. This time, he got a job out of it. What happened was, Pepper called Carney's Furniture to get rendezvous instructions for his last job, a warehouse ripoff. The job had gone off without a hitch. A rug wholesaler on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, Royal Oriental, received a shipment from a particular overseas supplier twice a year. Ship comes into port, sits at customs, they offload the rugs and carpets and what have you, and Royal Oriental forks over the dough. The night before they pay for all that inventory, the warehouse safe is full of cash, foreign rugs being a notorious way to wash money. Some jobs, it was like Burma again. People whose faces you never saw, who you never talked to, plan the setup, and you have to hope they have their shit together when you know they don't. He never met the bankroller of the Brooklyn robbery, or the finger, the man inside with the info on the wholesaler's cash flow. Pepper's partner was Roper, a lockman he'd worked with a couple of times. Roper had his head screwed on straight. That it went south at one time had been no fault of his. The brains behind the setup brought Roper in, Roper brought Pepper in, and if Pepper didn't get the other names on the job, it was fine as long as he got his pay. The moon was full. A breeze huffed out humid air to Jersey. It was a beautiful night to be out in the city and up to no good. Pepper subdued the night man and got him out of the way. Roper punched out the safe. There was a guard dog at some point, the main thing being that nothing went sideways. They were back in the Chevy Bel Air and on the bridge like that. And 2 days later, when it was time for Pepper to pick up his cut, he used Carney as an answering machine. Pepper only used the furniture store when things were in the clear, as in the clear as things could be, given his line of work. He'd want to mess things up for Carney if he could help it. If he couldn't, fuck it. Point was, he wasn't going out of his way to bring down heat on the man. Roper had left the address for Pepper's money. Carney delivered the instructions and then cleared his throat. "I'd like to bring you in on a job." "What, you need to move a couch?" Pepper said. "No, it's a job." Pepper said he'd head over after he picked up the money. The furniture salesman explained the job. At first, this didn't sound like Carney, but then Big Mike, his father, had tended his crop of grudges like a farmer, inspecting the rows, taking care they got enough water and fertilizer so they grew big and healthy. "You want Dirt to blackmail him?" Pepper said. "Blackmail is when you try to get something from somebody," Carney answered. "I want to burn his house down." "But not really torch it, you want to fuck him up." "Yes, not an actual torching, but a real burning down." "I know you did it like that." Carney shrugged. Like father, like son, they did a deal for the stakeout and the general surveillance. Pepper's grandpa Alfred had kept a steel drum smoker out back in Newark on Clinton Avenue. He'd do ribs, brisket, make his own sausage. Grandpa Alfred's father had been a butcher and cook on an indigo plantation in South Carolina and passed down the mysteries. "You throw chops on some coals," Pepper's grandfather said. "That's one way to cook a piece of meat. Few minutes later, you got that black on it, you're done. But barbecue is slow. Put it in that smoke, you gotta be ready to wait. The heat and smoke's gonna do its work, but you gotta wait." One was fast and one was slow, and it was the same with stick-ups and stakeouts. Stick-ups were chops. They cook fast and hot, you're in, you're out. A stakeout was ribs. Fire down low, slow, taking your time. Pepper was a gourmand in that he liked chops and he liked ribs. He hadn't planned a job in years with the legwork that entailed. Casing the place, clocking the passenger and vehicle traffic, how often the prowl car made the rounds, the schedule of the staff, managers, and security guards, figuring out when to take a piss. He'd enjoyed that side of things once, conception, pulling it all together, choosing a crew. Nowadays, he let the ebb and flow of jobs take him. He wasn't as sharp or as hungry as he used to be. Stuff fell into his lap, or didn't. Some cat got out of Dannemora and wanted back in, or another dude was cooking up a big score. Maybe Pepper wasn't as sharp these days, but the quality of hood they turned out now, he was sharp enough. No, he hadn't made ribs in a while, but it came back quick.
Thank you, Colson. Thank you so much. Now that you are all in the mood of this Colson's last book, I will presenting him very quickly. Can I? For everybody, just know a little bit about Colson. Colson Whitehead was born and raised in New York. He graduated at Harvard, was a television critic for the Village Voice, and started to publish books in 1999 with the novel The Intuitionist. At the time, John Updike wrote about the book and considered it ambitious, very ambitious. 7 more novels and 2 books of essays followed. One about poker, the other a kind of digression through New York City in essays. It is called The Colossus of New York and is perhaps the most intimate of all the books Colson Whitehead wrote. In 2016, he published The Underground Railroad, a novel set on a Georgia plantation and exploring the theme of slavery and the escape of slaves from south to north via a mythical underground railway line that connected the south to the north of the United States. With that novel, he won the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. The book was adapted into a television series by Barry Jenkins. In 2019, he published The Nickel Boys, a book based on a true story about a reform school for boys in Florida during the Jim Crow era. A brutal book about violence and racial segregation that won Colson Whitehead's another Pulitzer Prize. And now, for something completely different, this Harlem Shuffle that is translated in Portuguese with this title, Ao Ritmo do Harlem, just is on sale. Yes. It's the first volume of a crime trilogy. It begins in Harlem at the high of civil rights movement. Colson, it's a pleasure having you here again. And now I would like you to talk a little bit about your creative process. But first of all, do you have an explanation for this fact? You won 2 Pulitzers with 2 novels 20 years after you start writing. Why those novels? Why this happened to you?
I guess it was a bad year for fiction. You know, if you compare
two
my
bad
books
years,
to other,
two
yeah,
bad
2
years.
bad years. You know, a lot of people distracted, too much TV streaming. No, I mean, obviously, it's not something you can expect or even understand. It's not something I thought would ever happen. It's inconceivable. I think it's been a great couple years. It's allowed me to not teach and have side jobs. I just concentrate on my writing now. And 10 years from now, when nobody cares about me, I can look back upon this time as a very special period when people did care.
And what do you get from that period when you were an anonymous person?
Sorry?
You were an anonymous person 10 years ago. So you write, you teach, you can walk on the streets with nobody knowing you, recognizing you.
Well, I do get recognized
You remember
more
that
now.
life?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very private person, and I walk down the street and somebody, especially when I have a book come out and I'm in some magazines, I'm like, why is that person looking at me? Is my fly open? Do I have crap on my face? So it's sort of a disruption to my hermetic life, but obviously very nice.
Yes, but seriously, these 2 books, you consider these 2 good books, I know. Why?
I don't know. There are people like them. You know, I think they're all good. I think my poker book is really good. My zombie apocalypse book is really good. But I can't understand how people will receive them, either readers or critics. So I just try to do my best each time I go out, so that my first book about elevator inspectors is the best book I could write when I was 27, and Underground Railroad is the best I can do when I was 45. So each time I think I've done the best I can do, and it's nice when people come along for the ride. When they don't, you start the next one, and keep doing what you've been doing, which is not trying to fail your ambitions for this or that project.
When did you figure it out you want to be a writer?
I was very young. You know, other kids would leave their houses and do sports. You know, I like to stay indoors, watching The Twilight Zone and reading comic books. I love Stephen King. My mom would buy the annual Stephen King. It would make the rounds of our apartment, going to my sisters and then me. And it seemed, until I got to college, I wanted to write horror novels like Stephen King, like The Black Salem's Lot, The Black Shining. If you took any Stephen King title and put The Black in front of it, that's what I wanted to do. So making up stories about Spider-Man or the X-Men seemed like a really great job when I was little.
And you start going in imitating that kind of stories, imitating
Well,
writers.
I didn't write a lot of fiction. I never really wrote short stories. I wrote 2 short stories in college that I used to audition for the writing workshops, and I was turned down each time. And I was very depressed, but looking back, that was good training for being a writer, because when you're a writer, no one wants to read your crap. There's a lot of rejection. So if you internalize that hatred early, you're prepared when you go out into the world. So it was good training.
Okay, but that first book that you published, The Initiationist, has a good critic. John Updike read it, and he said it was very ambitious. Do you
He said
remember
nice
that?
things. I remember like the one thing he said that was negative, of course, which is that there are too many adjectives. And he was actually right. Usually you get a bad review and you're like, this person's stupid. And now I look back and I think, I really did like adjectives in my late 20s.
You do?
I did.
Well, you
I've,
did, you
I
did.
have a little more control now, I hope.
More Hemingwayan. But every book, you have 10 books, 10 books. You have essays also, but 10 books. Every book is very different from another one. How did you approach to the themes that you are writing?
Well, in terms of varying the subject matter and genre, it just seemed to make sense. If you do something once, why do it again? You know, I was a big pop culture junkie when I was a kid, and I loved Stanley Kubrick movies. I loved David Bowie. And in that late 70s, early 80s, David Bowie would always have a different persona from record to record. Stanley Kubrick would do his war movie, his science fiction movie, his black comedy. And I think maybe I just internalized the lesson that each time you go out and do something, it should be something new. If you know how to do a novel about slavery, do something else. So in terms of picking subjects, I get my ideas from everywhere. A newspaper article, someone on Twitter tweeted about the real life model for the Nickel Boys,
Yeah.
And from that one tweet, I sort of started doing more investigations, and the story stayed with me. With Harlem Shuffle, I was with my wife in the car.
The new wife?
With my wife, yes, yes. My forever wife is how I think of her. Actually, it's a big occasion is happening this week. I'm taking my driver's test. I'm getting my driver's license, if I pass, on Friday. After years of not driving, because I'm from New York and no one drives in New York. But my wife was driving. I was thinking of, what movie should I rent tonight? Like Ocean's 11. Again, I keep renting Ocean's 11. And I was thinking about how much fun they must have had coming up with that caper, the job, the heist. And I wondered if I could write a heist novel. So it's really, I just stare off into space, completely devoid of thought or emotion, and then a thought will occur to me, and if it stays, maybe it's a book.
You mentioned Twitter and the Nickel Boys and the genesis of Nickel Boys, and I would like you to explain how that happened, and after you wrote Nickel Boys, how this Harlem Shuffle happened, because one thing has to do with another. You read about Nickel Boys on a Twitter, and then you wrote about Nickel Boys, and then you get depressed, and then you saw Ocean's 11. How was that?
Well, it was all sort of. I'm a little scared because I got all my good ideas in 2014. So in 2014, I decided to do Underground Railroad. That summer, I came across the story of the Dozier School, the model for the Nickel Academy, in my book. And then I also decided to write a heist novel. So I usually do like a serious book and then a lighter book with more jokes. I wrote Underground Railroad. I thought I was going to write Harlem Shuffle. And then in the Nickel Boys, if you read the book, there's a very optimistic boy and a very pessimistic boy. And when Trump got elected, it seemed that I could wrestle with my own philosophical dilemma through the Nickel Boys. Is America headed in the right direction, the wrong direction? Should I be hopeful for the way we're headed? So I did not write Harlem Shuffle. I wrote Nickel Boys instead. And then I was very glad that when I finished Nickel Boys, I had all these notes for Harlem Shuffle that I'd been accumulating. Each time I read a crime novel or saw a heist movie, I would take notes. So when I started Harlem Shuffle, I had so much background stuff I'd already done. I had a real head start from thinking about it for so long.
How did you make that research for Harlem Shuffle? You mentioned movies. There is also some crime novels or crime novelists that you read. How did you get to that slang, for instance, of the 60s and the 50s?
Yeah, I mean, with this last run of historical novels, the most important form of research has been first-person documents. So for Underground Railroad, that was slave narratives, memoirs of former enslaved people. With the Nickel Boys, the survivors had their own website where they would reach out to other survivors, and they would tell their stories of being at the school, 2 paragraphs, 2 pages. And I really got the feel for how they talked about the place. They called the place where they got their beatings the White House. And I can't really compete with their own, White House in D.C., White House on the campus of the school. And so you get a lot of material that you can't think up, you can't compete with. With Harlem Shuffle, it was great to read crime novels, but also memoirs of people. Bumpy Johnson was a famous Harlem mobster, and his wife wrote a memoir about their time together. And she kept talking about Mount Morris Park, where they would dump bodies on Saturday night. If you just maimed somebody, broke their legs, you might slow the car down and throw them out in front of Harlem Hospital. But if you killed them, you had to dump the body somewhere. And it seemed like every Saturday night there's like a line of people dumping bodies in Mount Morris Park. And I could not really compete with that, so that went in the book. William Burroughs, who we know for Naked Lunch, the beat writer, one of his early books is called Junkie, and it's about being a low-level addict and con man in Harlem in the 40s and 50s. And there's this great slang that's not used anymore, but is very evocative. So
Can you tell us a sentence in that slang?
the narco squad, so the narcotic squad, he's always talking about, and then the narco squad busted me. And it sounds so evocative. In the passage I read, I mentioned a prowl car. So prowl car, radio car, cop car, squad car, these are different names for police cars in the 50s and 60s. So when do I use cop car? When do I use radio car? When do I use prowl car? All that, I'm trying to figure out how to deploy realistically all this slang I'm accumulating.
But go on with that examples that you are giving of movies and also writers. I know that you have the Invisible Man in your head when you start to make the research of what time would you
Well, I was
to the
trying to
book?
figure out Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man's in a lot of my work, not so much this book, but I was trying to figure out when the heist would take place. I had New York City. Should it be in the 70s, the 60s, 40s? And before I'd settled on a time period, I thought that my robbers would exploit some big New York calamity that would give them cover for a crime. So 1977 blackout, good opportunity, kind of obvious. I thought a race riot, 1940s race riot, but Ralph Ellison used that in Invisible Man. He's the man, he owns it, I can't really compete with that. Luckily for me, unfortunately for the people who were hurt in the riot and killed, there was a riot in the early 60s, and that seemed to make sense. In the end, that section of the book happens a week later. I didn't want to exploit the tragedy, and so in the aftermath of the riot, the city's trying to get back together, and that's when I come to the heist. But other antecedents, in terms of heist movies, I like Ocean's 11, but it's kind of a cheat if you can spend $1 million on a an electromagnetic device that knocks out all the electronics in Las Vegas. My guys are a little more low-tech, and so I was looking to Rafifi, the 1950s early heist movie, The Killing by Stanley Kubrick, Asphalt Jungle, John Huston, and then there are various 70s low-technology crime movies like Dog Day Afternoon, The Outfit, The Taking of Pelham 123, in which some robbers sort of hijack a subway car and hold it hostage. And it's full of these New York types who are very angry and sort of barking at each other. And hopefully some of that's in the book. In terms of novelists, I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to read a lot of crime novels. I haven't read a lot of crime novels lately. And I kept getting all these detective novels and cop novels. And I was like, I don't give a shit about cops. I care about criminals and psychos. And so Richard Stark has a series of books about a psychopathic criminal named Parker who's very good at his job. But if you're going to pull a heist, you need other people to work with. And everyone he works with is always terrible. But he's a great character. And some of him is in Pepper, I hope, the character Pepper. Patricia Highsmith in her Ripley novels. Ripley is a divided soul. He sort of knows he's a criminal, but can't always accept it. And that sort of speaks to some of Carney's, my character, Ray Carney's divided nature. And then finally, Chester Himes, 1950s black novelist, writing about Harlem in a series of novels. And it's a very anarchic, chaotic Harlem. And hopefully I've captured some of that in the book.
Yes. Before we go on Harlem Shuffle, I would like to go back a little bit at the Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys. When you gain, I don't know if we can say that, but you have a political voice with those books. No matter if you want or not, but you conquer that voice. How is to deal with it as a writer when what you want is right, and you have to answer questions about politics because people want to hear you about that themes.
Yeah, I mean, in Europe, there's a real tradition of writers speaking out about the issues of the day. Most of my writer friends have a lot of dumb ideas. Like, I don't want to read an op-ed from my friend, Larry. He has stupid ideas. Stick to fiction and poetry, and don't write any editorials. So I'm glad that European intellectuals have things to say. They can write poems and novels, and also talk about Vladimir Putin. Most of my friends who are writers have stupid opinions, and I don't want to hear them opine about what's going on in the world. For me, if I have something to say, I put it in the book. I mean, I am narcissistic, but I don't feel like I have to have my name in the paper all the time, talking about this or that. It made sense, definitely makes sense after Underground and Nickel Boys, which deal with institutional racism, to talk about race in America. A book like The Nickel Boys, the main characters are black. There is a race riot sort of off the page in the book. But it's not about that. It's a character study. And so when I hit the road and I have to talk about Trump for the millionth time or explain, I'm asked what's next for a Black Lives Matter? It's I don't know. I'm not actually in Black Lives Matter. I didn't get the telegram today from Black headquarters, I can't really help you. I'm not talking to them every day. So it does get tiresome, but also sometimes the books do lend themselves to a conversation about how we live and where we're going, and then sometimes they don't. So.
And here we are talking about the way you write, and you were a cover of Time magazine, and Time magazine considers you the great American storyteller. I'm not going to ask you what you think about that. I don't know if you want to say what you think about that, but...
Well, it's ironic, because usually I'm just in my underwear, padding around depressed, and then something like that happens, and it's ironic juxtaposition, if they could see me now in my natural state, they would not say that.
But you must have an idea of what is a good story. What do you think it's a good story? What makes a good story for you?
Well, I'm judging a contest now and reading a lot of contemporary fiction, and really you can tell. I can tell from the first page whether the writer is on top of their game or merely competent. You know, definitely there's something as I'm going through this stacks and stacks of novels, something magical that's happening on that first page where he or she is just in command of the material from the first sentence, and then the second, and it gets really exciting that you know you're going to go on a journey, that they've done something that no one else can do. Like no one else can write this book. So it's very lovely. And then there are people who are perfectly fine. There are people who are younger writers. I'm like, could I have edited this book? I would have just cut that adjective. Just there are things where you see people, a spark in people, and maybe the third or fourth book, they might sort of figure it out. So for me, it always ends up being about language initially. And I've written books that are plot heavy, like Harlem Shuffle. I've written books that have no plot at all. I have a book about growing up in the 80s called Sag Harbor. And the most dramatic thing that happens is that the kid gets his braces off in chapter 8. So not very plot heavy. But there's something just lovely about sentences that, being carried along by a very strong voice, whether there's a plot or no plot, that, I feel in the first page of a book.
Yes, and I was here looking for the first sentence of the first page of this book in English, because I have here the translation in Portuguese, but I have here the original in English. And the first sentence is this: his cousin Freddie brought him on the heist one hot night in early June. If you read the book, you understand how much of the book is in this first sentence. How much time it took you to get to this form?
Well, definitely the first paragraph always gets worked over, so much. So I'm working on something now, and it's really early, but that first paragraph is getting worked over a lot. I do a lot of outlining before I start, and so I know. I don't know everything. I don't know the names of the characters, but I know what's happening in the last section. And definitely with these last couple books, I've known the last scene or the last sentence before I start writing. And I think it's hard enough to find the right words each day. If you don't know what's happening, it seems twice as hard. Some people, they sit down, like the muse comes to the window and like guides their hands. I live in New York, the subway sucks. The muse is like stuck in Queens and I have to get back to work. So if I outline the book, I know what I'm going to do each day. And so when I wrote that first paragraph and that first line, I know what the last scene of the book is. And I'm writing toward that. I'm always writing toward that final scene. A story, a novel has a philosophical palette. Is this a story about transcendence or freedom or despair or tragedy? All that is in there in the beginning. You're heading towards this place where all the themes are being realized, the plot is being realized on the last page. But the first page should be immediately pointing to that final reckoning. So I have to know the end before I can do the beginning. And I can't, once I nail that first paragraph, it's a really sort of strong foundation for me.
And here we have Carney. And Carney is the big character of the book. This is the book of Carney, as you said. Can you explain this? Because this name, Carney, has lots of meanings. Can you tell us, because when you choose a name in a book, that is important to you. This Carney.
It is, yeah. I mean, usually, like sometimes the names are really well thought out. Sometimes they're random. If I see my friend Michael on a Tuesday, and then the next day I need an evil dentist, maybe it's going to be named Michael, because that's in my head. Sometimes it's random. I remember for my first book, one of the main characters is named Fulton, and he's sort of like a theoretician, and someone asked me one time, so Fulton, like Foucault, right? That's the reference. It's like, no, I just lived on Fulton, looked out the window, and I saw the street sign, and that's
Fulton
why his
subway.
name, and that's why he's named Fulton. In the case of Carney, I knew I wanted a one-syllable, two-syllable name, sort of random. But I knew I wanted dun 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 dun, and I was auditioning names and came across a reference to the Honeymooners and Art Carney, who was the sidekick on the show, old sitcom The Honeymooners, and Art Carney. There are a lot of black people who have sort of Irish names from 3 generations past when their mom or dad was white and Irish. So it seemed to fit, and then Ray Carney just sounded right. So there's no.
It was a sound.
It's a sound, yeah.
And the sound gave you the rhythm of the book?
Well, there is a rhythm of the book, and I think it's in that first sentence, in that first paragraph. I knew it was going to be sort of jazzy, fast, staccato, hard-boiled, hard-bitten, and so hopefully that's in the rhythm of the sentences. Sometimes you have a narrator who writes in extravagant 5-clause pile-up sentences. Sometimes they're more direct. In this case, hopefully some of the prose has that hard-boiled rhythm.
How did you choose the narrator's voice in your books? Because he's not a first-person narrator, but it's a narrator that knows everything about the characters.
Yeah, I mean, you pick the right tool for the job, and sometimes a first-person narrator is your best job. Sometimes an omniscient narrator who's in everybody's head does the trick. With this book, I knew that it would be mostly Carney's story. There are brief forays or trips into Pepper's point of view and his cousin Freddie's point of view, but it really is Carney's book. And that's saying whose story it is. You're saying it's Carney's story. Whereas a book like Underground Railroad, we stay with the main character, Cora, but I do give 7 other people these brief biographical chapters where we get into their head in a way that Cora cannot see. And for me, that opens up the story a lot. So you pick the right tool for the job. It used to be that I would start writing a book, and then around page 80, the narrator would sort of congeal or cohere. Then I'd go back and fix the first 80 pages and bring them up to the now dominant voice of the book. But starting with Underground, actually my poker book that I started actually here in Lisbon in 2011, I got the voice really out of the gate. And
here? You get the voice
here? The poker
here?
book, it was a strange assignment. I got a job to write about the World Series of Poker, and I was very excited, except I had never played tournament poker before, so I had to go to Atlantic City and train, and I got a poker coach. I would drop off my kid at school, and the other parents would be like, "Oh, Colson, what's up?" And I'm like, "I'm going to Atlantic City to gamble. I'm taking the midnight bus back." So I had to train, and so I was training all spring, and I was here in June for a writers' conference, and July was the World Series of Poker. So I was writing up my training episodes here in Lisbon in 2011. And starting with that book, the voice came early, and it's been it's a lot easier when you have the voice right out the gate.
And at what time of the book did you got this voice? First, you have the
before I started writing. I mean, when
Before?
I started, it was there when I started writing.
So you got Carney. We have Harlem in the 60s and the 50s. Carney is more interested in his own survivalness more than in civil rights movement. He's a hustler. I don't know, maybe. It's a kind of return to your hometown, New York City, this book. You call New York my New York. I mentioned the Colossus of New York, your book of essays, that digression that you made in New York. What is your New York? Can you define it?
Well, there's so many different New Yorks, and I think if I got it right, I would stop writing about New York, but I haven't gotten it right yet, so I keep just trying. So my first book, The Intuitionist, has an allegorical New York. It takes place in a vague 20th century, and it's not necessarily totally realistic. My book Zone 1, zombie novel set in a kind of utopian New York, because everyone's dead and there's no competition for taxis or lines in supermarkets. And then in this book, it's a realistic New York that I'm hoping to recreate so that people who were there in the 60s can recognize themselves and their places. And some of the nicest letters I've gotten are from people who were there in the 60s and recognize the Harlem of their youth. And so I grew up in the city. I get so much creative energy from the place.
And you are a walker in the city.
I'm a big walker. Like I said, I don't drive, but you know, my only exercise is walking around. And a lot of research for the book was just walking around Harlem. I hadn't lived there since I was a little kid, so it was really kind of new territory. And I would just get lost. I would take the subway up to 180th Street and then walk in between, finding different streets, location scouting. Like maybe Carney lives here, next to the subway, and that's unpleasant. Or maybe this is Pepper's house. Just taking notes. Then I get home and I Google, did this building exist in 1960? When was it put up? So I'm trying to verify that all these places were actually existed in 50 years ago. And I've said that I don't do the same thing twice, but I've made this into a larger project where I've written a sequel to Harlem Shuffle, and I'm working on a third one that takes place in the 1980s with the same characters. And writing 1,000 pages about one character seems like this was daunting, but also incredibly exhilarating. You know, I was writing about the 70s in the second book that I finished this spring, and it was during the pandemic, and so the streets were empty. It's a very depleted city. There are all these articles about New York is dead, New York's not coming back. And you felt the desolation in the streets. But I felt very energized working. And I was thinking about the 1970s in the city. The city was broke. Crime was at an all-time high. But in that devastated city, there were artists working, and that's where we got hip-hop, and we got disco, and we got punk, New York salsa. The city's in a terrible state, but artists are working. So I felt I was part of this, tradition of New York artists trying to keep it together and bring the new version of the city into being. So yeah, I love the place, and I still have another book to write about it. So I'm looking forward to it.
It's the first time you are continuing with the story.
Yeah, I mean,
what made you do that?
There were characters I liked, and briefly thought I would continue. Zone 1, my zombie story, I thought I might pick up a minor character in the same world and follow them, and then I lose interest and work on something else. But halfway through Harlem Shuffle, I just kept coming up with different crimes. It's like, what if Carney did this, or what if Pepper did that? And so it seemed okay to break the rule. So the second book is also has 3 parts, 3 different crimes. And I'm working on the third one, coming up with little devious schemes, and it's been just a really lovely, creative time for me.
Yeah, for people who love New York, this is a really good book because we can Google the addresses and we find the difference between what was there and what is now. That palimpsesto, as you mentioned another day, that the city is as city is, and people who lives in the city likes to discover is there. It's very nice to travel in the city with this book. And I one of the things that I would like you to explain is because with Carney we are assisting also at all these transformations that happens in New York, and we are looking at New York from now, to a New York that existed in the 60s from now with our eyes of the moment, and there is I don't want to spoil nothing, but it's difficult not to spoil here.
Well, I think, we were talking about the other day, and at one point, Ray Carney's downtown, and he's in a neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore. It was called Radio Row, and if you're a TV or radio hobbyist in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it's where you would go to repair your radio and get new parts, and it was destroyed to make the World Trade Center. And so, of course, we know about all the different changes of that neighborhood. Carney can't see what's on the horizon, and I'm recreating this place that has now been demolished. And then the thing that replaced it was demolished, and then there's something new there. And I really wanted to capture that dynamism. I think Harlem is especially interesting. It's uptown, so it wasn't settled as early as downtown Wall Street area. It wasn't until the late 19th century that they started building townhouses for a population that didn't exist. And the original residents were German, Italian, Irish, Jewish immigrants from Europe. And they ascend the social ladder, become middle class, they move to a different neighborhood, they move to the suburbs. Black Americans from the South came trying to escape Jim Crow and segregation. People from the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, from the Caribbean, Barbados. My grandmother was from Barbados and came through Ellis Island in the 20s. And so they replaced all the Germans and the Irish. And it's the same townhouses. Some of those same townhouses are still there. And these different generations of immigrant populations have come to make themselves in New York. And I find it very lovely. And now, Harlem's being gentrified. It was run down in the 80s and 70s, and now, of course, is expensive like every other place in the city. And the great-grandchildren of those Italian and Irish and Jewish immigrants are now moving back to Harlem and have come back. And I'm sure their ancestors are like, what the fuck are you doing? I tried to get out of there, and now you're paying $3,000 for a studio apartment? That's ridiculous. So, it's such a, I hope my enthusiasm is coming across.
Yes, it is, and I learned a lot with this book. Lots of little details. That Seneca Village, I don't know. Can you explain what it is?
Sure.
Because it's amazing.
If you've been to New York, Central Park, very lovely place. Center of Manhattan. Before it was a park, people lived there, and as what happens when the city fathers get an idea for something, someone has to move, and so there was a Black and Irish neighborhood in what is now Central Park called Seneca Village, and they had houses, they had churches, schools. They mapped out Central Park and raised it all and erased it, and everyone who lived there, dispersed. So, so that's in the book. I mean, it speaks to the change that I was just describing. Carney's family, his wife's family, is a sort of hoity-toity upper class Black family, very proper doctors, lawyers, and they're descendants of this Seneca Village. And so I'm using this historical fact to talk about the changing city, and then also the class differences. His in-laws look down upon him for being from the wrong side of the tracks. They're from this, very sort of mythologized lineage. And so I can use this New York factoid, this little bit of history, to talk about class, to talk about progress, talk about changing times. And when, sometimes you come across a historical tidbit in the book and then you write it down, like I want to use that, and it won't fit. And then sometimes you find something like Seneca Village, which has all sorts of resonances in the larger themes of the project.
Yes, because we have also here themes that are like race, like class, like relations of power, and speculation and corruption. And I read an article, I guess it was in the Atlantic magazine, that wonders if New York was made in a base of crime. And you mentioned that in the book, and you have also that examples in your family, but maybe we all have in
well, I was telling a story, yeah. So someone sent me I mentioned in an interview a couple years ago that I didn't know much about one side of my family. They're lost in the void of slavery. And so someone took it upon themselves to like do genealogical research and found a lot of my ancestors. And they sent me a news clipping of Archie Whitehead in Georgia, who shot his landlord. He was drunk, and the headline is like "Drunken Negro Shoots Landlord," and he didn't want to pay the rent. And so I shared this clipping with my sisters, and my sister was like, "Oh, but did you know that Grandpa, the son of Archie Whitehead, used to run moonshine for the mob? He would bring it down from Canada to New York." And that sounds too good to be true, because I'm writing about. So I asked my mother, and she said, "I don't know about that, but in those days, everybody did a little something, you know, sort of like just to survive, you have to bend the law a little bit." And that speaks to sort of Carney and where he is. You know, he wants to be this upstanding person, but maybe you have to bend the law a little bit to do it.
You mentioned the rhythm, the sounds, but you also write a lot with images. I guess your books are plenty of images. You are a very visual writer, aren't you?
I think maybe just being raised on television, you know, I was one of those 70s kids raised, like, where are the parents? Not really clear, but the TV was always on. And so part of what I'm doing when I'm writing is getting my inner images onto the page. And so that means I have a lot of visual, I use a lot of visual language. Yeah, I don't want to overthink it, but probably just being raised as a child of TV and film has influenced how I see things and then how I describe things to the reader.
Yeah, people are making me signals. We have to open. We would like to open.
Yeah, we don't have to.
The public. Now the questions. I hope you have questions to ask to Colson.
Do you have any questions or advice, life advice?
The furniture is important. Yeah.
It's on? Okay. So hi. Can you hear me? From okay. So I just wanted to ask about the specific. I'm Miguel. I translated that book. So.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Miguel.
Hi. Okay. So I just wanted to ask about the specific furniture angle, because that gives a kind of. It comes at New York at an angle, specifically. The fact that he sells furniture and looks at everything through furniture. And then there's a kind of, initially not so much, there's a kind of link between furniture and real estate, and then it becomes stronger as the book progresses. Right? Furniture, at first, I mean, he wanders around looking for flats where he can move to with his wife and his family, but then suddenly that becomes a kind of less a personal topic for Carney and more of a kind of collective issue.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what kind of living room set you have, your dining room set says so much about who you are. What can you afford? How do you see yourself in society? And so he's selling lower priced furniture to families who are just starting out. And part of making him a realistic character is having him comfortable with this language. You know, part of that research comes from the internet. No matter what your interest is, someone else has put it on the internet, and so there are 60s and 50s catalogs from furniture companies I can go to on Pinterest and steal all that language about the champagne finish on the birch coffee table, the same way I'm stealing gangster language from the mobster's wife and William Burroughs. So the same way Seneca Village has a lot of different meanings in the book, or can talk on these different wavelengths. So does furniture. Furniture becomes a way of talking about people's social aspirations. It's his job. Is he good at his job? And then going into the topic of real estate, you know, sometimes your books are autobiographical, sometimes not. In the case of Carney, we both have this curse where we think that the next apartment will cure us. And so I'm always going through life like, I'm gonna move this apartment, it's so great, and then it's like, is that the fucking subway rumbling again, you know? or there's no closets. Why didn't I notice this? And so part of Carney's social climbing is finding the perfect apartment that will fix him, has enough room for the kids, and will cement his middle class status, if that makes sense. But thanks for translating the.
Hi. Well, but I can ask.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Hear me. Ricardo here, just a reader. Two questions, if I may. Are you planning to write something about or taking place in the present or eventually in the future, maybe New York or elsewhere? Second question, you mentioned Stephen King, who's just amazing, who's a genius. He wrote a book on writing. I don't know if you've read it. Do you have writing habits? What are your writing habits? Could you share with us a little bit about
Sure. So the first thing was,
side
what's the first part?
on future?
Well, I write about contemporary America or something in the future. My first books, that are not translated as yet into Portuguese, are very contemporary, and they very much deal with how we live now and internet culture. And I got to a point where I felt I started repeating myself, and I think I ran out of things to say. And I thought that if you have nothing to say, you should just shut up. And so I may at one point have something to say about how we live now once more, but right now I'm getting more energy out of historical work. I think that there's like a really angry 27-year-old who probably knows more about how we live now and has a really firm opinion about it than me. I'm middle class, complacent, middle-aged. I just worry about my mortgage, stuff like that. I don't have the same fire as I used to, but there's probably an angry 20-something who can really nail contemporary life in a way that I'm not able to at the moment. In the future, Zone 1, my zombie apocalypse book, did take place in the future, but only 2018. So I wrote in 2011, and it's like, it's going to be in the future. People holding tablets and stuff. And mentally, it's 2018, which is now the past. So maybe one day, again, I will write a book that's set in the future, a little further in the future. And then my writing habits, so I talked about outlining. I have to have a good outline. The middle can be fuzzy, but I have to know the destination before I set out. Some people say you have to write every day. That sounds sort of punitive and a cramp in my lifestyle. So I like to do 8 pages a week. For me, that's an accumulation. So like Monday and Tuesday, and then Saturday and Sunday, if I'm doing like 1 to 3 pages a day, that adds up. After a month, that's 30. After 10 months, that's a novel. That's how I look at it. It's such a long process and terrible process to write a novel that if I feel I'm making progress, it makes it a little more manageable. So 8 pages a week, that seems like a good accumulation for me these days. What else? Like 10 to 3 is a good amount of time. That's like 1 to 3 pages, writing from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Maybe take a nap, have a little crying jag, come back to work, eat a sandwich. I write at home, not in cafes. You can't like break down weeping in cafes. It's frowned upon in society. So I can do all sorts of weird things in my house and write and get work done. What else? When I was a younger writer, I would share my manuscript in progress with my friends. And then by the third book, no one wants to read your unedited manuscript. So now I show my wife's a very good reader. She's a literary agent, and she's a really good person. I show my editor and my agent. And I can get to like a third of the way through, and then I need a reality check, just so I'm not crazy, So with Underground Railroad, I was like, I'm a total psycho. I'm making this metaphor into an Underground Railroad. I'm such a freak. And then after 100 pages, I showed my wife and my editor and my agent, and they were like, keep going, it's okay. And so I need like a reality check. No matter how strongly I feel about the book, I need a reality check. With Harlem Shuffle, which I see as 3 novels that make one novel, I would finish one story and then send it to my readers and get feedback, and so it's less lonely that way to share it. And that's about it, I guess.
Thank you. My name is Daniela. I would like to thank you for your presence in the foundation, because when we think a lot about American culture and American writing, we see a lot in Europe, but focusing in England, in France. In a personal note, I would like to say that I really enjoy your books. My friends usually say that if the novel is the Oscars, the Pulitzer is the Independent Awards. So you're in a good track. But my question is regarding Underrail Railroad. You said you are a visual artist, or you see a lot when you write your books. So with the adaptation, how close were you connected to it? And how was to see your writing, your work in a different medium? How close was it to your imagination?
Sure, yeah. No, thanks so much for reading and for the question. Adaptation, Underground Railroad, made into a TV series by Barry Jenkins, who made his mark with Moonlight. I thought, it turned out incredibly. I knew it would be good because he's so gifted, and then they worked on it for 3 years and came up with this just stupendous, piece of work, from the actors to the cinematographer, set design. I met the guy who did like the period haircuts, for people. They just really, it's such an astounding, it was one of the best gifts I've ever, I think my kids, my wife, and then this series, like the world gave me this incredible thing, which makes me sad because any other adaptation cannot be as good. I'm not supposed to say that. But, it really, it was very moving. I was not that involved. I was working on the Nickel Boys, and so I was not going to put that down. I did have one suggestion, which was ignored. I'm not sure if you know the actor Walton Goggins. He's does comedy and serious roles. Usually plays like the redneck who's like inbred or something. And so it was my idea, sort of like the movie Dr. Dolittle, where Walton Goggins could play all the white characters in the movie, in the TV show. So old white lady, Walton Goggins, like little white kid, Walton Goggins, through like prosthesis and CGI. So I tweeted that to Barry and never heard, I don't know if he wasn't on Twitter that day, but he didn't respond. So I didn't contribute, and each time they came with me with like a question, do you mind if we do this? It was always a really elegant solution. It's one thing to have Cora, the main character, in an attic for 70 pages. It's very static. But you can't really do that on film. You need something. So they had a solution of how to make the attic more dynamic, and it was really, genius. They changed things, which gave me the experience of not knowing what was going to happen. And so I was able to sort of experience my own work as someone coming to it for the first time. And that was great when I didn't know where they were taking this digression. So from start to finish, just a really beautiful thing for me.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Nielsen. Thank you for your presence. I have 2 questions. The first question is, I believe you are asked a lot as a writer, but I'd like to hear from you as a reader. What captivates your attention? And for you, what is the difference between a good writer and a bad writer from a reader point of view? And the second question is, writing as a side job and as a full-time job, which are for you the difference, and which phase do you take more pleasure in? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, well, I guess, when I was teaching to pay my bills, I would have to, some people can teach and write at the same time. For me, I find the personal interaction very onerous and depleting. So I can only write when the semester's over. So that would mean, like, with the case of Underground Railroad, I was teaching at 3 different colleges so that I could buy 6 months off to write the book. And so I would get this war chest, and then I was adjuncting, I didn't have a regular gig. But I would work really hard, getting all this money for teaching, and then that would allow me to not work for 6 months to work on the book. It's very schizophrenic, and ideally, I can just think my beautiful thoughts all the time. So it's but there's a reality principle, and you have to, every artist has to figure out how to support their art and also make a living. It was much simpler when I was younger, and I just had to buy cigarettes and beer. Now I have children, they demand food and shelter, so I have to make more money to feed them and shelter them. So, but that balancing act is always part of being an artist, no matter what field you're in. And it's better not to have that than to have that burden. So the first question was
Reading habits.
reading habits. So
No, sorry to interrupt you, sir. Not really reading habits, but as a reader, what captivates your attention? And for you, what is the difference between a good writer and a bad writer? Your opinion, your thoughts
well,
on
I
that.
think
Thank you.
there are different things. I mean, I like a good crime novel doesn't necessarily have to be well written if the twists and the characters are compelling. And so I'll give a writer a pass on language if the situation is compelling. I have to know what's going to happen even if the metaphors aren't necessarily as colorful as I'd like them. And then you can have a book that's so incredibly boring, nothing is happening, but the voice is so compelling that you can't put it down. So I like Ulysses by James Joyce. It's just like two dudes walking around all day. It's like 800 pages, incredibly boring if you describe it, but the language keeps you in there. And often, you know, when I'm writing, working on my own work, I'm like, okay, this book has no plot, but can I convince the reader to keep going because the voice is so compelling, this character is so interesting, their thoughts are so intriguing that even though he's just getting his braces off and he's like a teenager, nothing's happening, the reader wants to stay because he's so interesting. So there are different trade-offs. Obviously language, you know, again, I can read the most boring book ever. If the sentences are so beguiling, I can't put it down. It means I can't put it down. And I'm not a snob about what people should be reading. You know, sometimes I'll give a talk, and in the signing line, you know, a parent will say, you know, little Johnny just wants to read comic books. How can I get him to read serious literature? If he's reading, let him read. All my friends who now write serious literature, you know, read Marvel comics and wanted to write because they wanted to make up goofy shit. And so it's Michael Chabon, Jonathan Lethem, Junot Diaz, all of us were really big comic book readers, and our first stories were fantastic stories. When I wrote my zombie novel, you know, people were like, why are you, a literary novelist, writing a zombie novel? It's why, because I like fucking zombies. You know, life is short, you should be writing what you want to write and not worrying about what's literary, not literary. Just make it good. And I love to read a good zombie novel. I love to read incredibly plotless, stream of consciousness, exploration of someone's interior life, if it's, you know, well written. So, thank you.
I guess, is that all? Thank you, Colson, for
Thank
being
you
here.
for all the great questions and conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you for
you
coming.
all being here. Just one thing, Colson will be signing books over there, for anybody who wants.
Yes. Yeah.
There, from the other side of the door. Thank you.